Thank you all for coming. My name is Sharon Witherspoon. I'm director of the Nuffield Foundation, one of the three funders of the project, along with the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the Trust for London. I have to say, I can't, it may be bad form, but I'm going to start by congratulating all the researchers. It has been 2.5 years, 3 years, very hard work, lots of engagement with the funders about which areas to cover, what sort of data, problems when data that was supposed to be available weren't, the issue of how to make sure it's as rigorous, as balanced, as impartial, and as fair as possible, and lots of time spent on that. And I have to say, I think they've done an absolutely stunning job. So I really hope everybody in this room will also engage. This is meant to be a resource not just for policymakers, but for wider public discussion. And that means getting it out, of which this is only part of what we're doing, is really important. So use it, cite it, encourage other people to use it, talk about it. That said, this session is on employment, cash transfers, poverty, inequality, and so on. So it is covering the sets of issues that are not to do with some of the institutional structures like education or health or whatever that are covered in the rest of the report. And we're going to start first with Abigail McKnight, who's going to give a presentation on the employment policy, and then move on to John Hill, who will talk about the cash transfers poverty, and then we will have time for questions.
Thanks, Sharon. With the Coalition's aims when it came to employment policy focused on supply-side measures, much in the way as the Labour government that preceded them did in terms of welfare-to-work programmes and so on. And in the paper I described this more of an evolution than a revolution. A lot of the policies were just expanded or maybe toughened up and rolled forward. There were three main areas in the Coalition agreement: tightening up eligibility for out-of-work benefits, increasing conditionality, ending the existing welfare-to-work for all existing welfare-to-work programmes, and creating a single programme to help all unemployed people. Well, it really isn't a single programme. I mean, there is the work programme, but there are many contractors involved, and it's very much black box-based policy, and so there's certainly no single programme there. Plus, short-term unemployed and long-term unemployed are treated differently, but we'll come on to this a little bit later. There are various reforms of what was on offer in Job Centre Plus offices, and then through the work programme. A little bit on equalities, promoting equal pay, extending the right to request flexible working for all employees, and a fair pay review in the public sector, a Liberal Democrat policy. The Coalition agreement was really largely dominated by policies that are outlined in the Conservative manifesto, just one or two influences from the Liberal Democrats. In fact, I did my note in the paper, welfare doesn't even appear in the index in the Liberal Democrat manifesto. It was not a large feature of their policy commitments. So in terms of key policies, there were changes in welfare to work, both for the short-term unemployed with new measures and some mandatory elements for job seekers in terms of work activity and skills conditionality training. For the long-term unemployed, the work programme, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail, replaced the flexible New Deal very quickly. In fact, after the Coalition came into government, contractors are paid by results, with differential rewards designed to incentivise securing stable employment, but also in terms of helping those who were deemed as needing extra help to get back into work. And people stay on the programme for 2 years rather than 1 year, which was under the flexible New Deal, which they were welcome. I put vigilant use of sanctions there. We don't cover sanctions really, I think, sufficiently, but quite clearly sanctions, which were always there as a threat, have now actually become a reality. Eligibility change, in particular incapacity benefit claimants, assessed through work capability assessments, which were of course introduced under the Labour government in 2007, but used much more widely in terms of assessing all incapacity benefit claimants. The youth contract, which if we have time at the end, I'll come back onto, but there's a whole contract set up for helping young unemployed people, and the evaluation evidence suggests that it has had some success. And then unemployed people with limited capacity for work, increasingly required to participate in active labour market programmes. It's mandatory for many. Even those over time who had a 12-month prognosis, they were not expected to be work ready for 12 months, but were referred to the work programme. And we'll see that actually the outcomes in that group are really very low. And we have to question whether that is the right approach for that group. In terms of expenditure, well, as Sharon said, employment isn't really a typical area of services where there's cuts and we look at productivity and things. But this chart shows how real spending in 2009-10 terms and as a percentage of GDP changed over time. The dotted line is the ILO unemployment rate. That's the annual rate. We're going to look at more detailed unemployment rates in a bit. But you can see that generally speaking, expenditure on employment services goes up and down with unemployment, as you'd expect. The peak in the early years was to do with the windfall levy that the Labour government brought on and financed the new deals. And if you look at the end here, you can see a dip in employment expenditure, which looks slightly odd given the fact that unemployment rates didn't change very much over time. But this was to do with a switch to deferred payments under the work programme. So by paying by results, you don't pay for today, you pay for outcomes in a year or 6 months or 2 years or even 3 or 4 years' time. So this will have to be paid back in the future. We estimate that if you think that expenditure should stay at the level that it was prior to moving to this system, and if DWP's estimates are correct that they'll be delivered at about 2% lower costs, this amounts to about £3.3 billion that still will need to be paid for employment services that have been delivered during this period. So I'm going to move to the work programme. The work programme, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, was contracted out to private providers, largely private providers, 18 private providers who held 40 contracts. They can subcontract out for different services. There's a black box design, so they're free largely to deliver what they think are the correct interventions to help people back into work. Although there are minimum standards, and these have been tightened up, inevitably for accountability reasons. So it's not quite as free as originally, I think, envisaged. Job Centre Plus refers claimants to the work programme. There are 9 different claimant groups, and these are called payment groups that DWP defined. Some of which have mandatory participation, some are voluntary, and they're referred at different points in their claim. So JSA, Job Seekers Allowance claimants, young 18 to 25-year-olds are referred if they've been unemployed for 9 months, and then 25 plus are referred after a year. So there's a variety. Employment and support allowance claimants are referred immediately after their work capability assessment. So contractors are paid for job outcomes, and a job outcome is 3 or 6 months of cumulative work over, first of all, we look at outcomes after a year or after 2 years. They don't have to be continuous months of employment. So that's just the total amount. And then 4 weeks sustainment payments. So if they're continuously employed for 4 weeks after the job outcome, well, it could be a gap in between, then they're paid extra sustainment payments. And these payments are higher for those which are regarded as being harder to help and need extra intervention. So if we look at, I drew the line on the last chart which showed the minimum expected level. I mean, just to come back to that. This is a DWP estimate of no intervention plus 10%. Well, at least I think that's what it is. It does vary a little bit in their documentation as to actually what it is. And it's calculated for different groups, and each cohort actually, although it looks very flat, it actually does wave around a little bit depending on the intake, because different minimum expected outcomes vary. This minimum expected level is below, quite well below, what the department originally envisaged the programme would deliver. 6 months for JSA claimants, 3 months for employment and support allowance claimants. If we look at, this is after 12 months, so it's halfway through the programme, I've put this potentially on a 100% scale because you can see there that the vast majority after 12 months have not achieved a job outcome, so 3 or 6 months in employment. At the beginning of the programme performed very poorly. It performed less than would be expected, even with no intervention, so goodness knows what was happening. They've been held out of work. By the end of the programme, you can see it's above the minimum expected levels. On this chart, I've blown this up to a 50% scale here, and I've shown you the variety of different, these aren't all the different claimant groups, but you can see here the job seekers allowance claimants who had less barriers to work are performing better and performing above the minimum expected level by the end of the programme. So there has been progress, but there has also been a fanning out, and so there's been a widening in the gap between JSA claimants and employment and support allowance claimants over that time. So there have been improvements for some groups, but the majority is still not achieving a job outcome. So if we look at some of the longer term outcomes, I'm not going to go through all of these now so we can keep to time, but after 2 years, as you would expect, more of the participants achieve a job outcome. 22% for the first cohorts, rising to 28% for the later cohorts. And about 2/3 of them go on to find sustainable work. So about 18% of all participants are roughly achieving sustainable employment by the end of the programme, which means the vast majority are being passed back to Job Centre Plus after 2 years. The answer to that now is help to work, but I'm not convinced that this is really going to do anything better in terms of getting those job seekers back into work. The National Audit Office assessment concludes that it is roughly delivering what other programmes before it delivered. And there's also a worrying concern about creaming and parking going on with particularly employment and support allowance and JSA claimants. And although incentive payments are higher for these harder to help groups, they don't seem to be enough. And in fact, when you work out the likely success rate of getting them back into work, it's very much similar amounts that we estimate would be available, between £700 and £1,000 to help throughout the course of the programme. That's pre-profit to help these job seekers back into work, which I think clearly isn't enough. If we move on now rapidly to look at unemployment rates by age, we can see here the big rise, as Gavin was mentioning in the first session, rise in unemployment rates for young people. And although the labour market has actually held up very well over the recession, these unemployment rates are very high for young people, and there is evidence that they've come down. But as you see here, 18 to 24, slightly worrying tick up at the end there. And the big fall here in the younger rate coincides with the time that the education leaving age was raised to 17. So there's good news about unemployment falling, but there are also some worrying concerns. So we look overall at unemployment, this puts all of those groups together, and the gap between claimant count measures of unemployment and ILO measures of unemployment, they did widen historically over time, and so roughly about half unemployed people qualify for benefit. Of course, there are concerns there about what that means in terms of household income. So unemployment rates have fallen, around half qualify for unemployment benefit. And although you see statistics banded around about 90% of JSA claimants leave their claim of unemployment within 12 months, in fact, that sounds very good, but if you look then about what happens, about half of them come back within 12 months. So there's a cycle of unemployment. Yes, a lot leave, but a lot come back. So over 2/3 of the unemployed people during the work programme have found work, to return back to Job Centre Plus at the end, so the vast majority have not found work after 3 years. So one area which has created a lot of interest is the growth in self-employment, and I'd say that the growth in self-employment really drove the recovery in the labour market. So it's increased to about 15% of total employment, up from about 8 or 9% before. But the average income from self-employment has plummeted, so it's 22% lower than it was before the recession. The growth has largely been in terms of sole traders, drivers, hairdressing, building, gardening, or professional services selling probably their services back to the government. It has become a more prominent route out of unemployment. There are various schemes, which if I had time, I would talk about, such as New Enterprise Allowance, which seems to have helped probably about 60,000. It's not going to be much of a dent on these figures here. Help support them initially in terms of self-employment. And certainly what seems to have happened is that the flows into self-employment haven't changed very much, but the flows out have, as if there might not be other options out there. So we have to see how that's going to evolve over time. In terms of wages, which has been a big story that you're all going to be familiar with, about falling real wages and the effect of this on living standards, we've done some extra work in the report looking at how wages change for employees who stay in work over the course of a year, and the drops haven't been anything like as low for that, suggesting that entry wages are really what took the hit over the recession. But even at the median, you're finding negative real wage growth, certainly for some points over the recession, even though the mean is in fact positive for that group. So it shows that we have to be very careful about looking at distributions in hourly wage growth, and hopefully we'll be able to do some bit more work on this. Here I've reproduced some work done by ONS looking at cohorts. These are cohorts who are aged 21 in 1975, 85 and 95. And you can see the dips down at the end where the real wage cuts came in. So this period covers 1975 to 2013 from the ASH data. It's hourly, real median hourly earnings within an age group. You can see there how the wages have fallen so much that, say, for 39-year-olds, they're now no better for the 1995 cohort than they were for the 1985 cohort at the same age. And you can see also, if you compare the two older age groups, despite the fact we know that these groups are better qualified and so on. Challenges for the next government. Come on time. Well, the labour market held up pretty well, actually, over the recession, but there was falling real wages. There was a strong policy platform, which the coalition took advantage of when it came in. But I think one of the most important features of why the labour market held up very well was there was no large-scale industrial restructuring. In previous recessions, we've seen large-scale industrial restructuring, particularly which meant redundancies and skills of older workers. We haven't seen that fall in unemployment rates for older workers in this recession as we have seen in previous. That's possibly why the young have been hit particularly hard. I think the labour market was in good shape prior to the recession, and I think that the workforce was well qualified, fairly adaptable, and has shown to be very flexible over this. But there's a big problems in terms of a productivity challenge, improving employees' real wages, and I would say beyond the fortuitous falls in inflation that we've had in the last month, and self-employed incomes. And one of the really critical things is there needs to be a really speedy replacement for active labour market programmes. That's the work programme actually finishes in March 2016. And so the next government is actually going to have to replace the work programme in a shorter amount of time than it was introduced. And that's, I think, a real challenge. I mean, clearly we are doing a lot to help unemployed people get back into work. But these kind of results, they're not breathtaking, are they? And so... Unfortunately, the evaluation evidence does not seem to be in place so much now. And I think that's partly because the government's thinking we'll leave it to the private sector to find out what works and what doesn't. We no longer need to work out ourselves. So I think that does pose a challenge in terms of what we might replace it with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Can I just check, I should check with both of you, will this presentation be going on the SPCC website?
I understand so, yes.
No, I think it would be very...
Bert, the answer is yes.
Because I think I should have clarified that beforehand. It just means I can see you don't have to take down every nuance and listen. So, sorry, John, go ahead.
Yes, everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Right. And I think we're being filmed, aren't we? We should have announced.
Oh, yes, I should have said that.
Any of you who didn't want it to be known that you're here...
Keep your heads down.
You should have been keeping your heads down.
Can I ask a question? Because I am going to ask who you are, but go ahead. Sorry, John.
Okay, so we'll kind of do this seamlessly because the two things are obviously closely related. First of all, I should say that the work I'm reporting, and by being in this session, you have the privilege of a beautifully printed copy of both Abigail's full report and my full report on cash transfers. They will all, everything is available online in vast detail, and the one online does not have the incorrect sentence on page 28. Kitty Stewart kindly pointed out on Monday. But I should also give some credits. This is reporting parts of this report, joint work with Paolo D'Agostini and Holly Sutherland at Essex University, which we previously published in working paper 10 in the series, and some of it uses work that Ben Richards, who's in the front row of the audience, kindly helped me with. And a lot of it, naturally, given the area we're in, uses or reflects on analysis by the Institute for Fiscal Studies in this area. It's a little hard to keep up with everything, given that they produced a major report on Friday, which I have to say is not reflected in the text, but actually I'm relieved to see comes to very similar conclusions. And I don't know what IFS is going to be saying this afternoon about benefits, but I'm sure that will also be useful, and I hope is not out of line with what I'm saying here. I should also say that I try to avoid using the word welfare. I write at length about why I avoid using the word welfare in a book I produced last year. But what I'm talking about by cash transfers are pensions, tax credits, social security benefits, and so on, rather than welfare, which can mean about 10 different things. I was very struck in writing this and writing the narrative of how policy evolved under the coalition, how dominating, when you're thinking about cash income distribution, how dominating two Liberal Democrat commitments from their manifesto have been in the life of the coalition government. The aspiration for a higher personal income tax allowance, up to £10,000 this year, £10,600 next year, that was a very expensive commitment and therefore constrained their room for manoeuvre. And the triple lock for pensioners, which over the long term is clearly a lot more generous than price indexation, however you measure it, and actually is more generous than earnings indexation for some complicated reasons. Both of those really colour the whole picture of the net effect of what the coalition has done. There is also a very important effect of decisions made on how to uprate benefits. And really I can't stress enough how important it was that the initial rule which had applied that benefits would be increased in line with prices, the switch went to the consumer price index rather than the retail price index, was maintained for the first 2 years of the coalition's life. But from April 2013, that's the mistake on page 28, although not earlier in the paper, weirdly, that was broken from April 2013, and we now promised a 2-year freeze, depending on the rate of inflation, a real cut coming from April 2016. So if inflation's the rate OBR was saying 2% a year, then that's a further 4% real cut in working age benefits to come. There is also, I'm sure people in the room, I won't go through this, a long list of specific cuts, often focused on really quite narrow groups. I think one of the big features of the debate about, quotes, welfare is the illusion that what is often labelled as welfare, cash transfers to working age people who are not in work, is a big part of the budget. And a consequence of that is the illusion that you can save large amounts of money from it. Well, you can save money from it, but only by being really very harsh to particular groups. And some of the list of measures take that form, particularly things like some of the housing benefit limits, bedroom tax, council tax benefit reforms, and so on. So there's a long, quite familiar list of these things, many of which came in from April 2013, not all of them. Things like the child trust funds were abolished pretty well immediately, but a lot of these things, the scale of the cuts accumulated over the life of the Parliament. This goes alongside something which doesn't come out in anybody's modelling, I don't think, certainly not ours or the Treasury's, I think, which is the increased use of sanctioning. And part of that picture of a growing gap between ILO unemployment and claimant count unemployment will be to do with the number of people who have been sanctioned, which has risen pretty well at the same speed that the number of people using food banks has risen. But then, for the future, there are very big reforms in train. Universal credit hasn't really happened yet, but it is coming, and it's a major change with some very interesting effects, as I'll show in a moment. But also, the single-tier pension is, you can argue, a step in the same direction as the reforms started by the last government and continued under this one. But a very big change comes in April, which is so-called pension freedom from the responsibility to annuitise your pension to get a retirement income for life in return for all the tax reliefs you have. That's a very big change. It will initially only affect new retirees, but Pension Minister Steve Webb has been talking about extending that. Now, the big picture in terms of spending is shown by the top graph here. I'm sure you can't see the detail. Even I can't see the detail. But this shows the changes in real spending by three categories of benefit receipt. Benefits, not just the state pension, but other benefits going to pensioners on the right-hand mountain, you see there. The change since 1996-97 in real terms. And you'll see that spending on pensioners' benefits of one kind or another is up by £45 billion by 2014-15, compared with where it was before the last Labour government came in. So real spending on pensioners went up under Labour, and it's continued to go up under the coalition. By contrast, spending on benefits and tax credits related to having children, although interestingly, as Kitty pointed out, not including maternity allowance, so this is related to having children that have been born, rose quite significantly under Labour, £20 billion of extra spending in real terms, but has been falling under the coalition. So a big change in direction is that the last government favoured families with children and pensioners, but not other working age benefits, whereas under the coalition, it's only pensioners that have seen real increases in spending. Other working age benefits fell under the last government until the crisis, and they're now, after the crisis, they're about £8 billion higher than they were back in 96-97 only. And if you see then what that means for shares of GDP going in different directions, pensioners taking spending on pensioner benefits 6.6% of GDP, the same as it was in the year before the coalition came in, whereas the share going to families with children, to child-related benefits and to other working age benefits have fallen as a share of GDP. Now that has some very interesting effects on incomes by age. Now we can only track these things through to the most recent figures. People in the room probably could do this for 2013-14 already, but published numbers until June only take us to 2012-13. But even by 2012-13, you're beginning to see effects on the profile of incomes by age. So what this shows is by 5-year age group, households below average income kind of income definitions, starting with 0 to 5s, then going up to...
That's the youngest person in the household being those ages.
This is taking the household income and attributing it on an adjusted, equivalised basis to its members.
Yeah.
So the parents will be in the middle of this, and the babies will be on the left-hand side,
right.
And the older people, whatever kind of household they're in, getting a share of income. If you look at the blue bars, if you can see that in the middle, back in 97-98, there was a very considerable age-related pattern. And one of the things Labour did, which I think is because of its concentration on pensioner poverty and child poverty, but also just general transfers for pensioners and children, was to narrow that considerably on an unadjusted basis by about a third. That narrowing has continued up to 2012-13 for people over the age of 60, but has been reversed for the youngest children. And that's something that I think we're going to see more of. So the welfare state does a lot of income smoothing over the life cycle. That was accentuated hugely under the last government. That's happening. That continues as far as pensions are concerned. We haven't done modelling of this, although I'm actually going to in a moment, for the future. But the balance of policies suggests that this tilt will continue. So there are these, I think, quite familiar age effects, but it's quite interesting to see them spelled out like that. We'll be looking at much more detail at this kind of thing in a report we're producing in March. Now, what's happened to poverty and inequality, again using DWP IFS numbers, depends on, we only have the numbers up to 2012-13. It turns out to be crucial which year, if you want to say what's happened under the coalition, it turns out to be crucial which year you count as being the starting point for the coalition. Is the starting point 2009-10, the year before they came in, or is it 2010-11 when the rules of the tax and benefit system had been set by Labour, the year, if you like, election year? Because there was a very big drop in inequality and some drop in relative poverty in that year. And since then, inequality for 2 years is flat. Poverty measured against an absolute line has been rising for the last 3 years of this diagram, and particularly if you measure that after housing costs. So part of the story is this initial phase that benefits were left at the level inherited from Labour, which were protected, people at the bottom were protected, while in that year incomes higher up the distribution were falling quite rapidly. In the years up to 2012-13, price protection was still in place at the bottom, so although there were some cuts, they weren't yet having a very big effect. So whenever you hear a statement about inequality is at its lowest level for X years, as you can see from the lines in the bottom diagram, remember is means 2012-13. It doesn't mean today. Now, beyond that, we're dependent on modelling. And the Treasury does modelling, we do modelling. We've done some modelling using Euromod from Essex, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies does a great deal of modelling. You already saw the top right-hand diagram. One of the crucial things in this, which is emphasised in the report which James Brown and colleagues from IFS produced on Friday as well, is it does matter a lot what you take as your initial system. Was it the system in the tax year 2009-10, before the coalition came in, or was it the tax and benefit system as inherited in May 2010? One of the crucial differences that makes is if you start from, say, January 2010, it turns out that the top tenth have lost as much or indeed more than as a percentage of their income than anybody else. But a lot of that is a result of changes that were made in April 2010 that the previous government had announced the year before. If you start from May 2010, as we do, you get the picture you saw earlier, and just you follow the black line. This is not including indirect tax changes, not including all of the nuances of things that have happened to the very top about tax avoidance, and there's an issue about how much you allow for pension tax relief changes. But the basic picture is the same. It's regressive in terms of direct taxes, also if you throw in indirect taxes, from the bottom of the distribution to about 75% of the way up the distribution. And you see that in the Treasury analysis, you see that in the IFS analysis. The top diagram there compares with everything being price indexed, and as Ruth said earlier, that was actually neutral if you look at the main direct tax changes and the benefit and tax credit changes. That was not contributing to deficit reduction. Change in VAT certainly did contribute to to deficit reduction if you split it in that way. But essentially the cuts in personal tax allowances, which benefit the top two-thirds of the distribution, a bigger share of income for people just above halfway up, were being paid for by benefits rising less rapidly than the consumer price index. The bottom diagram shows the same numbers. If you assume that benefits and tax allowances have been increased in line with average earnings, and given that average earnings were falling in real terms, that makes the whole system look a lot more generous than it would have done if benefits and things had been cut in line immediately with falling earnings. But the general shape of the line is very much the same. There is, when you look at the top, the other thing I think I would point out is that we've done this analysis in 20ths, partly because there are lots of differences within the top 10%. I'm a member of the top 10%. I'm not paying anything very much more as far as I can see. And yet, a lot of the analysis shows people in the top 10% are putting quite a lot in. Well, a lot of that is coming from people who are a great deal better paid than me. Our Vice-Chancellor and Director is, I'm sure, paying more one way or another. He's being averaged out with me. It's not the whole of the top 10%. And again, certainly the analysis from IFS has stressed that it's the very top that are putting things in, but not as much in percentage terms if you start from May 2010 and people at the bottom. And then we can argue about what the effect of the top tax rate cut was. Maybe nobody really knows the answer to that. Let's look further ahead. Now this one I've switched to doing this on comparison with an earnings linked basis all the way through from May 2010 to 2019-20 to get an idea of what effects all of this has on distribution. When one builds in the further freezes in tax in benefits for 2 years from 2016, some of the other changes that are coming in after April, partial transferability of allowances between married couples, further increases in the personal allowance. And if you look at most of the income distribution on the right-hand side there, this diagram is on towards the end, about page 47-ish, maybe less than that, of the paper you've got, if you want to look in detail. It accentuates the story we already know of the years to 2014-15. That is, the nearer you are to the bottom, the bigger your losses are, those are accentuated. The nearer you are to the top, the less your losses are, although people are still losing ground by comparison with an earnings-linked base. So over most of the income range, the regressive effects of policy as currently announced, and this is before all of the, quotes, £12 billion of welfare cuts that we are promised, which is a very large number, have been factored in because we don't know what those will be. However, you'll see that at the bottom, we're factoring gains for the bottom 10% as a result of an assumption that universal credit, as currently planned, will be in place by then. And a further completely crucial assumption, which we make and the Treasury make, I can't remember what IFS does. IFS assume full take-up. We think it's very important how you allow for take-up in all of this. The numbers we do don't show such large losses at the bottom as some of the IFS analysis because we allow for the fact, we try to allow for, I should say, that not everybody claims all the benefits they're entitled to. This becomes very important when you think of the possible effects of universal credit coming in. At the moment, there are people who will be entitled to universal credit who are only claiming, let's say, their child tax credit, but not their housing benefit. Claiming their housing benefit, but not claiming their job seekers allowance. The assumption built in here is that if you're claiming one of the benefits that you're entitled to at the moment that are being folded into universal credit, you will get universal credit. That creates very big gains for some of the poorest people in the country who are currently not claiming all their entitlements. That's the stated intention of universal credit, that it will have benefits for take-up, and that creates gains for some people at the bottom. It has a very big effect on the distributional numbers. So we're assuming here that you get this boost to take-up. That might not happen. If the reason why people aren't claiming some of the benefits that they're entitled to is that they're more stigmatised than others, and if the effect of everything being merged into one is it all becomes stigmatised welfare, the effects would go in precisely the opposite direction. And we could see people not claiming any universal credit who were getting, for instance, child tax credit at the moment. And that would have exactly the opposite effect. So that's very uncertain. If you put all of that in, that would take the overall, lots of other things are changing, but just by themselves, those changes would increase the relative poverty rate by 1.8 percentage points over that period. That's not inconsistent with IFS's 3.5% increase in child poverty up to 2021, which I quoted earlier. So the end result of that is, I think one has to think about coalition policy in this area in three phases. The first phase is really dominated by the non-decision to not come in the June budget in 2010 and say, this is the 1930s, we will cut benefits. I think it's 5% they cut benefits by in the 1930s initially. That did not happen. And yes, the switch to CPI indexation was announced, but up to 2012-13, that protection was continued, even while incomes were falling in real terms higher up. That has a very big effect on the numbers that are currently visible for poverty and inequality. And a very important effect. It was the welfare state doing its job. So people at the bottom hadn't benefited from all of the upside of the good times, but they were protected from the worst of the bad times. That has changed since April 2013. So the second phase, since 2012-13, sees cuts in working age benefits, lots of specific cuts, but pensions protected. And the modelling work suggests, but it's only modelling work, and I think one has to remember that the combination across the distribution, alongside the increased personal tax allowance, is regressive across most of the distribution, and therefore implies rising relative poverty. That's the second phase, which we're still in. The third phase comes next, and as I've just shown, I think we would expect on the current balance policies them to have a continuing regressive effect. That would be enhanced if more of the promised future cuts come out of working age tax credits and benefits one way or another, which seems extremely likely, but comes in any case from a combination of real cuts in the overall level of working age benefits and the tax allowance going up. But there are huge uncertainties in all of this, which will face whatever government comes in. First of all, will universal credit actually come in? Will whatever rapid review happens immediately after the election when a new Secretary of State is appointed continue on the current line? Are we so stepped far into the implementation of universal credit that you really, it's like the trains before the First World War, if that's true, and maybe it wasn't, that we're on a railroad where actually implementing universal credit in some form is inescapable. But it could take a very different form from the current one. It might not include the good bits that the Treasury allowed as a sort of quid pro quo for some of its other cuts. Huge importance of whether take-up increases or not, or whether stigma increases. I think something that is hugely uncertain, and I'll talk a bit about at the end of the paper, is the effects of pension freedom of the non-annuitized people. At the moment, you save all this money as a pension, it gets lots of tax reliefs on the way, and you have to then turn that into a retirement income through buying an annuity. That won't happen in future. Now, the good side of that is you may be able to get something that's much better for you, much better attuned to your needs for the future than getting a not necessarily good value for money annuity bought at the wrong age, basically, of 65. On the other hand, there are already sharks out there probably about to send me texts saying that they have a wonderful investment in snake oil mining in Bolivia that will give a 10% return on my pension if only I hand over all of that money. So there are huge uncertainties as what this will do to retirement incomes. But also I think it raises very big uncertainties, going back to what Gavin Kelly was saying earlier, about the future of pension tax reliefs. If saving in a pension is basically just the same as saving in an ISA, because you can then do whatever you like with it, and there's no tie-in to keep you out of the government's hair in retirement, why should we be throwing in all those tax reliefs? Why should it be so much more fiscally privileged than an ISA? I think those questions are going to become very acute. A fourth point, which it may be that this question has been answered and I've just missed the answer. Part of the pension reforms that come in April 2016 are the end of something complicated called contracting out, which means that I currently pay a lower national insurance contribution rate than people in other kinds of pensions. My NIC rate will go up in April 2016, but I'll get a bit more state pension, so maybe I won't mind too much. My employer's national insurance contributions will go up by 3.5 percentage points. So will the national insurance contributions of every hospital, every school, every part of the public sector. I'm not sure, but maybe I'd be delighted if somebody knows the answer. I'm not sure that that's factored into, the savings are factored into the Treasury numbers for the future. I'm not sure that anybody's factored in where are they going to find, other than sacking one employee in every 30, where that 3.5% increase in the wage bill will come from. I think that's a big uncertainty. And also, we managed to go through, I think Gavin mentioned devolution at one point, but we've gone through all of this time without mentioning devolution. And yet part of the devolution agreement is a lot of devolution to Scotland. I hope this is lots of future research on this. And indeed, the Stormont House agreement just before Christmas gives more flexibility in Northern Ireland. How that will play out when we have a non-UK system, I think is also going to be fascinating over the next 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. And Abigail, thank you. We did start late, so I'm proposing to go on a bit, but I do want to give you a chance for questions. Can I just ask that you do say who you are and what institution or whatever you're from, just so we understand that. But questions of information, comments, disagreement, any welcome. It's here, and then...
So, on employment, I've seen no evidence going through the literature and the evaluation reports and looking at DWP statistics that welfare to work programmes have driven any jobs miracle. They're delivering roughly what previous programmes have done. Initially, for the first years, they delivered less. The rates of moving off JSA, are still lower than they were before the recession, and the fact that we basically have two groups of unemployed people: those that leave quite quickly, those that cycle back, and those that stay. In designing policy, I think that really trying to get at those three groups in a more systematic way, I think, would be beneficial. 60,000 have received a new enterprise allowance, a boost in their income for the first 6 months. It's not a big boost, £65 a week, then £33 a week. Well, 60,000 is a small drop in the ocean here. As you saw from the chart, self-employment has been driving the headcount. I mean, in terms of percentage terms, we're not at a peak. In headcount terms, we are, but the population's bigger. So, like I say, we've got more people in employment now, but there are more people. So, in terms of percentage-wise, it isn't. But that's not to say the labour market hasn't held up well. It has. But I would say that I haven't seen, going through the literature, the evidence, the statistics, that the welfare to work programmes have driven any jobs miracle.
I think one of the things that in a more broader welfare reform, if you call it reform, would be that I think a lot of that, I don't know, because I don't know whether anybody's done the work on it, maybe Abigail's seen it. Part of the growth of, quote, self-employment has been the difference in sanctioning regime in the current system between being out of work and being, quote, in work on tax credits, where you self-certify that you're doing the right number of hours per week as self-employed. I think a lot of that self-employment, Abigail quoted the 22% fall in real wages for real pay, real income for self-employed people. I think a lot of that is very marginal and reflects that not a lot of questions are asked if you're on tax credits. So one of the push factors of greater sanctioning has been people self-declaring as self-employed in very marginal work, getting less out of tax credits than they would have got out of work benefits, but still getting something and scraping a living somehow. I think the tax credit system was very important in allowing here, as in Germany, part of the adjustment to the crisis being a reduction in hours, with effectively the state taking 70% of the cost of that as long as people didn't go below 30 hours. I think that was a very important cushioning effect. I'm not sure how it's happened recently. As far as localisation of benefits, I am trying to be extremely balanced in the way I describe all of these things. But the two biggest pieces of localisation we've seen are council tax benefit being turned into council tax support and the social fund going to local authorities. I think the decision to localise council tax benefit and to cut the budget by 10%, with all of those savings coming from working age benefits, was both cruel and bonkers in the context of bringing in universal credit, where the idea is you put all your means tests in one place. And you smooth out all the wrinkles. We now have, however many local authorities there are, 300 different means tests. Somewhere in North London there's a council that's raised its taper rate to 30%, which completely undermines the aims of universal credit. But also they don't know what they're doing. I know from work I've done on universities are no good at designing means tests, some worse than others. Each individual local authority does not have the capacity to design sensible means tests. Devolving more in that direction with cuts in resources seems to me potentially disastrous, but of course does have the convenient effect of being able to blame somebody else for the problems. Right. Okay. Round over.
John Montes from Croydon Council. Of Bolivian ancestry, I have no comments to make on the prospects of snake oil manufacturing.
I'm so sorry. I hope they're good. I really hope they're looking up.
I have no knowledge of that. My question is about 0 hours contracts, really. What data were you able to use on that? What's the scale and impact of that? One here's about a lot of, I suppose, anecdotal general information. I'd be really interested to know what you came across.
Yeah. On zero-hours contract, we reviewed some of the evidence that the Resolution Foundation has produced and ONS has produced. We didn't do any new analysis on that. And they all come with cautionary comments that actually assessing how many zero-hours contracts there were previously and how many there are now is fraught with difficulty. Partly people, when a type of contract becomes more common and people think of it and give it a name, they're much more likely to report that is the case. So the statistics show, and I do quote them in the full paper, that there has been an increase in zero-hours contracts, and it clearly is the case from the evidence, some of the qualitative evidence, that these are lower quality jobs, that there is uncertainty of pay. I think there's a piece of research crying out to be done, which is to look at variability in hours of work week on week to see if that makes a difference. Do zero-hours contract actually lead to greater variability, or are they just generally about having very few hours of work? So they might not actually increase variability. I think we don't know. Actually, they might be fairly stable in terms of the hours they do.
I think it strikes me that 10 years ago, Abigail and I did a very interesting piece of research on fluctuations in people's incomes from week to week across the year, and it would be extremely good if somebody funded us to repeat that exercise.
I'd love to do it.
You have to write the application first.
But can I say, I think there is a very important issue here for universal credit. I think we've spent probably 150 years talking about the potential effects of wage supplementation on the level of wages that employers set, Speenhamland and so onwards, for those who remember that. We partly protect ourselves through the minimum wage. The really interesting change, one of the many really interesting changes in universal credit is that it merges the out-of-work system with lots of conditionality and giving people a hard time with a very different regime for people working above a certain number of hours. But you have to do the certain number of hours, or at least get away with telling HMRC that you are if you're self-employed. That goes under universal credit. Some of the big gainers from universal credit are single parents who would rather work 10 hours than 16 they have to work at the moment. That will put them in a better position. But it opens up a very interesting change for employers. We have lived with the idea that if you work in a shop, in the past you have a full-time contract or other things where from hour to hour demand goes up and down, but there's a sort of deal that there are busier times and there are less busy times, and the employer kind of, you'll rush off your feet some of the time, but the employer takes the risk of that fluctuation in wages. With zero-hour contracts with universal credit and no hours rule, that risk effectively can go to the state. So one of the virtues of universal credit is it will adjust quite quickly to people who have only a few hours one month and a lot of hours the next month. You'll get your parent payments varying immediately. But people will latch onto that. I don't know to what extent, but as they begin to latch onto it, they'll realise they'll be able to say to employees, actually, don't worry, your universal credit, we are laying you off for the next few hours, but your universal credit will go up. So it's not our problem anymore. And I think that's a change in culture. Who knows how that will play out with employers and what other reasons they'll want to hang on to people. That universal credit is just another ratchet in the direction of more casualisation of the labour market. I have no idea how that will play out. There are too few people getting it at the moment for anybody to tell, but I think that is a potential very large danger, as well as the sheer administrative, I think, impossibility of applying conditionality and sanctioning or whatever it is to people who are working part-time, saying, well, you're actually not working hard enough and you didn't turn up for the interview. But I didn't turn up for the interview because that was the hours I had. Well, actually, people get sanctioned for that at the moment. But I think it opens up a very difficult issue where it's easy to say, oh, it's stupid to have an out-of-work regime and in-work regime, but there were some benefits in having an out-of-work regime and in-work regime, and we're going to lose those.
And as you say, that the burden has shifted. So, yes, next. I think what I'm going to try to do is group 2 or 3 of you together so that we can carry on. So there, and then I'll take another lot.
Anne-Marie Brady, Department of Social Policy, LSE. Just a question for you, Abigail. I was interested in the fact that only 18% of those who participated in the work program entered the regular labor market or more stabilized. I read that right. correct?
Sorry, the say it again?
That only 18% of those who participated in the work program entered the regular labour market.
In terms of sustained employment, yes.
Okay. My question is, do you have any sense of why only 18%? Is there any kind of work being done on the quality of the work program, or the actual type of trainings that are taking place, and what kind of curriculum is going on, whether the weakness lies in that, or...
Okay, so hold on, I'm going to take two or three together. I think we need to move on. So we've got there.
Richard Rigby from Princess Trust. The youth unemployment saw a remarkable record fall, I think, over the last 18 months, and that take into account the recent tick that's appeared. However, looking at the analysis that you've done of the work programme, we know the youth contract, the numbers that have been held through that have been small, and probably smaller than the department would have hoped. To what would you attribute this large fall to?
Okay, and then we've got one more.
Hi, David Phillips, IFS. I have kind of two questions. One is about evaluation. So, one thing I've kind of noticed is that evaluation of kind of policies seems to not have taken place as much in kind of recent years. There have been some around employment, so I think there are two policies that have an impact. Local obligations and the welfare cap, there's been some work there. But I wonder what your kind of thoughts were on kind of the role of evaluation of social policy. You know, university credit has been around for many years. As far as I think there's no kind of real evaluation of what effects. And secondly, one thing that Gavin mentioned in his talk was the idea that, you know, the cuts, the across-the-board cuts might have come to an end, but what we might see is more targeted changes in eligibility. That actually is a bit strange, because actually some of the loudest noises from the cuts have been where they have been changing eligibility criteria. I wondered if John had any views on that, where the CC cuts coming from.
Okay, so take all those together and parcel them out.
Should I go first?
No, I'll just finish on the last one.
Okay. In terms of why only 18% go on and secure sustained employment, do you know that figure? If we look across, rich countries in terms of welfare to work programs, it's not out of line. The trouble is a lot of these programs are talked up a lot, and the way that politicians talk about them as if these programs are going to get everybody back into work and it's huge numbers flowing through, and like to quote, rather than the kind of added value, the actual numbers that flow through. So you can say it's small, but you could also say it's actually fairly reasonable for that group of particularly very hard to help. They've already, many of them, been unemployed for a year on that spell of unemployment, so they've had a history of unemployment as well. Some of them have got some very challenging issues that need to be dealt with. And I would say, if you look at the amount of money on average that it's likely that the work programme would have to spend, it's very similar for JSA claimants as well as employment and support allowance claimants, despite the fact that the payment is much higher. The success rates are so small for the hardest help group. So if you think £700, you try to spend that to get somebody who's quite a long way from the labour market back into work, it's not very much. And that's pre-profit. So these companies are in it to make profit, so it's only going to be a proportion of that. And I think that, is it big or is it small? And is it value for money? I think is the question. Youth unemployment, why has it been falling? Yes, I don't think it's all about welfare to work, although youth contract has shown that certainly the DFE element of that looked like it reduced the NEET rate by about 1.8 percentage points, which was quite a fair outcome. Raising the school leaving age helps as well. But I think that I actually think it's that the economy's recovering and young people are getting sucked in. We do, every time there's a recession, get really worked up about what's happening to young people, and then as the economy recovers, we calm down a bit, and then they will actually seem to do quite well. This one is particularly hard, and we might think that there's going to be some quite long-term effects in terms of earnings and income and scarring effects, but I don't think we know why it's actually fallen, apart from general the economy is recovering. Evaluation evidence is very quickly, so don't use up all the time. I think there's a real dearth of evaluation evidence. I think it is very important in terms of thinking about what works. The government could say, well, if we contract it all out to private providers, does it matter that we don't know what works? It's up to them now to work out what works. They're the ones who put the contract in. We tell them how much money there is. They work out if that's profitable. They work out themselves what works. But it's a little bit like reinventing the wheel. And actually, in the end, I think when you look across, there isn't a huge amount of variation in what these different contractors are offering. And you could certainly argue if they're not producing results much better than Job Centre Plus or the providers under the Flexible New Deal, that actually Job Centre Plus personal advisors were doing a pretty good job. It wasn't that it was disastrous and that the system was failing, but they were doing a fairly similar job. But I do think that in terms of thinking about what we might replace it with, about good evaluation evidence rather than just comparing the numbers that flow through and the numbers that get jobs, which get quoted, that we are now in a position of less understanding about what works, and I think that is a problem.
Let me echo that. I mean, I'm sort of thinking back to 2001 when we were writing things probably about similar things about what the early years of the last government had done. There was already some evaluation evidence. There were early studies, some of the most helpful ones done by the Institute for Fiscal Studies on things like the effects of the Working Families Tax Credit, a lot of work on the effects of the minimum wage as it came in. Those things began to become available. There were big structural shifts. There was evaluation evidence. There were very interesting evaluation, the New Deal for lone parents, for instance, done on a very systematic, interesting basis. So there was a lot of stuff. Writing this, there is much less of that kind of stuff available. Now, I think that wouldn't matter if this was a sort of Baldwin-esque do-nothing government. Maybe I'm being unfair to Stanley Baldwin, whose relatives may be in the audience. But one of the features of everything we've written, and I think as a sort of overview of the story we've been telling, is the way in which the current government has gone against the conventional wisdom. The conventional wisdom used to be, if you're doing you only do a reform when there's money around to oil the wheels, because we all know that losers scream more than gainers. So you don't do reform when there's no money. And actually, the attitude of this government has been very different. It's followed Rahm Emanuel, now mayor of Chicago's, but previously advisor to, or chief of staff, whatever it was for Obama, that you shouldn't waste a good crisis. And as a sort of overview of the picture we presented this morning, it's that they haven't wasted a good crisis. There have been big structural changes. And I think maybe the reason for that and the politics of it is that if there's a lot of bad stuff going on, whereas we used to worry about the losers screaming more than the gainers, if there's a lot of screaming going on, then a little bit more screaming just gets lost in the cacophony of everything else. So you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb. I think that's... So maybe just, that kind of world has changed. At what point people then think enough is enough, I don't know. So.
Can I also make an observation that I think one of the sad facts is it's been easy to cut evaluations. It's discretionary spending, central government mainly, easy to cut, easy to implement. And we don't have a regime until a National Audit Office gives a report and points something out, or a parliamentary select committee. There's not really a huge political constituency worried about it.
But if you're in an unexplored country, which, given the scale of the changes you are, it doesn't make sense to shoot the cartographers.
No, John, I'm on your side on this. I'm just saying, I think it reflects a real structural weakness, and until we have a model where select committees are even more able to say, we have these expectations, or the NAO. I see people are leaving, so do we have time for one more quick set of questions, and then we'll round up. So yes, there. Anyone else? Right, last one.
Richard Keat from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Kind of a couple of questions really. My first, I'm interested in what you said around the changes in outcomes around employment and about household income and cash transfers, and about the geographic picture across England, and about sort of like those areas of the country where there are lower incomes and those that are more hardest hit. I'm also interested in about anything that you looked at in terms of particular impacts for specific vulnerable groups, i.e. disabled people, about changes around conditionality in those areas and potential.
Well, can I take that as a golden opportunity to make an advertisement? You may know that previously we've been involved with a set of analysis which was originally started by the National Equality Panel, which looks at economic outcomes by the equality legislation groups. We did publish an interim report on that in July 2013, looking up the picture from 2007 to 2010. We will, it says in my schedule, on March the 12th, if that's the Thursday, in the evening at 6:30 at the LSE, be publishing a report looking at exactly that across wages, incomes, employment, educational outcomes, wealth, by those equality groups, looking at inequalities within them and between them, and how different groups have been affected, and including geographically. There will be a separate major report on London and how things have played out separately in London. That will be at some very close date to that in the middle of March. So we're not finished with social policy and cold climate yet. There's more coming, and I hope that'll give you some answers to that. So that's my quick advert. I mean, we already know something about young people, and a sneak preview. That has clearly intensified after 2010 up to 2013. There may be some recent improvements in that.
It's just a very quick response in terms of people with limiting illness and disabilities in relation to conditionality. I think it's very fair to conclude that the work capability assessments have been problematic, that the government both overestimated the number of disabled people who would be classified as capable of work in a limited capacity. They've had to, if you look at the share now of those who undertake an assessment who are classified as capable of work in a limited capacity, that has gone down considerably from the earlier ones, which, as you know, a lot of the cases were then revised. And then they have overestimated the share of those who are classified as capable of work in a limited capacity, who then actually go on and secure work. So I think that, that when they came in, they thought, well, there's a huge group of people there who are capable of work, who claim the incapacity benefit, and that actually, in the end, the employment rates haven't really improved that much because of those two factors.
All right, well, can I thank all of you, and I hope you've enjoyed a chance to get to know more. And as I said, it is all on the Social Policy and Cold Climate website, and please go out and spread the word. Thank you very much. And thank you.